When someone you love dies, how long does it take to find out who they really were? Edith Croyle believed she knew her husband on the day she buried him. She was 56 years old, 8 months a widow, and she had exactly $84.60 left in her checking account when she learned how wrong she had been. What she found at the top of a dead lighthouse, inside a desk her husband had kept locked for more than 30 years, would fill a county hearing room with weeping fishermen, stop a bulldozer cold, and answer a question Edith had been afraid to ask for her entire married life. Not whether Warren Tolliver had loved her, whether she had ever truly known him at all. Before her story begins, take a moment to subscribe, because we tell one story like this every single week, and tell us in the comments where in the world you are listening from. Now, the Lighthouse. The arithmetic of Edith's life had become very simple and very cruel. 4 years of Warren's illness had eaten everything in the order that illness always eats things. First the savings, quietly, the account statements arriving like weather reports from a country sinking into the sea. Then the truck. Then the boat that had belonged to Warren's grandfather. Then, in the final year, the house itself, sold in a hurry while Warren lay in a rented hospital bed in the living room, apologizing to her with his eyes because his mouth no longer worked well enough to do it out loud. His younger brother Dale had handled the sale. Dale was good with paper, everyone said so, and Edith had been too tired to read what she signed. When the funeral was over and the debts were paid, and Dale's own loans had somehow been paid first and most completely, what remained of 34 years of marriage fit inside a rented storage unit and one battered station wagon. $84.60. A woman can look at a number like that for a long time and feel the whole shape of her life inside it. But there was one more item in the estate. One item Dale had waved off with a laugh at the lawyer's office, the same laugh the whole Tolliver family had used on it for 50 years. On a headland called Pelican Point, on the coast where Warren had grown up, 5 hours now from the rented room in Deerfield where the illness had marooned her, there stood a decommissioned lighthouse. Below it, strung along the harbor, sat the village of Saltmarsh, where Warren and Edith had lived for 30 years of their marriage, in a gray house with a kitchen window that looked straight up the shore at the tower, until the doctors and the bills had dragged them inland to be near the regional hospital, 4 years ago, when everything began to be sold. The Coast Guard had shut the station down in 1971, unbolted the great lens, boarded the ocean-side door, and sold the tower and its keeper's cottage back to the keeper's family for $1. The last keeper had been Warren's grandfather. The family had called the place a chimney with delusions ever since. No electricity worth trusting, no water worth drinking, a cliff crumbling politely toward the sea, and a tax bill that Warren, for reasons no one ever asked about, had quietly paid every April of his life. "You can keep it," Dale had said to her across the lawyer's table, magnanimous as a man tipping a waitress with a coin. Nobody's fighting you for a chimney. Nobody had to, because 3 weeks after the estate closed, a letter arrived from a company called Mercer Coastal Partners, and the letter contained the first good news, if you could call it that, Edith had received in 4 years. Mercer Coastal was assembling land on the headland for a resort development, and it was prepared to offer her $900, described in the letter as a generous salvage consideration if she would sign the enclosed release permitting demolition of the derelict structures on her parcel. $900. It was not money. It was an insult with a stamp on it. It was also more than 10 times what Edith Croyle had in the world, and the rent on her room in Deerfield was due in 11 days. So on a morning in early June, Edith put the release in her purse, filled the station wagon's tank with the last of a gift card, and drove 5 hours east to sign away the only thing her husband had ever left her. She told herself it was one signature and one night. She would sleep in the cottage if it was dry enough, and be gone before the dew burned off. There was nothing on Pelican Point she needed. There was nothing on Pelican Point at all, she thought, except rust and gulls and whatever was left of a building that had not mattered to anyone in 50 years. She was wrong about that before she even switched off the engine. The last mile of the drive was a dirt lane between hedges of wild rose, and then the hedges opened. And Edith saw the point the way a person sees a photograph they did not know anyone had taken of them. The morning was bright, the sky a deep, working blue, clouds moving like laundry on a line, the grass of the headland so green it looked poured rather than grown, scattered white with early wildflowers. 2 gulls hung in the wind over the cliff without moving their wings, and above all of it, filling the sky at the end of the path, stood the lighthouse. It was taller than she remembered, white once, streaked now with long ribbons of rust bleeding down from the iron gallery like the tower had been wounded and had healed badly. The lantern room at the top was dark and blind, its glass panes fogged with 50 years of salt. The oceanside door was still boarded, exactly as the government had left it. At its base crouched the keeper's cottage, shingles silvered, one corner shouldered up by a wild rosebush that had clearly stopped asking permission decades ago. Edith got out of the car and stood on the worn grass path with the wind pulling at her jacket, and she felt what everyone feels in front of a dead lighthouse, which is that the building is not entirely dead and knows you are there. For 30 years she had seen this tower every day of her life, from the kitchen window, from the church steps, from the road to the cannery. And in all those years she had stood on this grass exactly twice. Once at 22, when Warren, courting her, climbed the fence with her to show her where his grandfather had kept the light, turning his cap in his hands as if introducing her to the old man himself. After that, the point was simply the thing at the end of the shore. Condemned, fenced, boarded, not safe, Edie. Warren always said, and he was the one who knew, so she never argued. He went out himself, most evenings after supper, an hour, sometimes 2, checking the place, patching a shingle, paying a village boy to mow the path. 30 years of evenings. It never once occurred to her to wonder why a practical man would spend half his life mowing a path to a building he never used. She was halfway to the cottage, keys in hand, rehearsing what she would say to the developer's man in the morning, when she stopped in the middle of the path so suddenly that her purse swung off her shoulder and hung at her elbow. There was a light burning in the cottage window, not a reflection, not a trick of the bright morning sun, which was behind her and could not have put that warm amber point in the small window left of the door. A flame, a lamp, lit and steady, glowing behind the salt-hazed glass of a cottage on a property that had been locked and empty for years, at the foot of a tower the family called a chimney, on a headland where, as far as Edith Croyle knew, no living soul had any business being. For a long moment she did not move. The wind moved the grass. The gulls said what gulls say. And Edith stood with her dead husband's keys biting into her palm, looking at a burning lamp in the window of a dead man's lighthouse, feeling the first cold touch of a question that would not finish being asked for weeks. Someone was keeping a light on Pelican Point. Someone had been keeping it for a long time. And before that question was done with her, it would take Edith down into a county record room, up 312 iron stairs, and back through 31 years of nights she thought she had spent married to a man she understood. She made herself walk to the cottage. She made herself knock, which felt absurd on her own property, and when no one answered she tried the knob, and the knob turned without complaint, and that was the second wrong thing, because Dale had told her the place was locked, and the keys were the only way in. The door swung onto a single room that smelled of kerosene, cedar, and cold ash, and of something under those, faint and unmistakable, that buckled her knees before her mind had even named it. Pipe smoke and machine oil. The smell of Warren's coat. 8 months a widow, 5 hours from home, in a building she had visited twice in her life, Edith Croyle stood in the doorway of the keeper's cottage and smelled her husband. The lamp stood on the table by the window, an old brass kerosene lamp with a glass chimney polished clean as a lens, burning with a trimmed, patient flame. Beside it sat a box of wooden matches, a neat coil of spare wick, and a white saucer holding the stub ends of matches, dozens of them, like small burned bones. Whoever tended this lamp did not do it once in a while. Whoever tended this lamp did it the careful, habitual way a person brushes their teeth, and had been doing it long enough to wear a pale ring into the wood of the table. On the wall above the table, framed in driftwood, hung a painted board that had plainly once been nailed outside, its letters faded by decades of weather but still legible, and Edith read it twice, because it seemed to be less a sign than a sentence someone had decided to live inside. "The light stays lit," it said, nothing else. No name, no date. 4 faded words that somebody, sometime, had thought were worth painting. Edith set her purse on the table with the developer's papers inside it, and it is worth being honest about what she felt in that moment, because it was not wonder. It was anger, sudden and bewildering. Somebody had been coming into her dead husband's building, burning fuel that somebody had paid for, polishing brass and trimming wick, playing house with the grief that did not belong to them. She turned a full circle in the little room, taking in the swept floor, the split firewood stacked dry by the stove, the 2 mugs hanging on hooks by a basin, and she said, out loud, to nobody, in a voice she barely recognized as her own, "Who is in my house?" The answer came from behind her, from the doorway, in the voice of a boy trying very hard to sound like a man. "Nobody, ma'am," the boy said. "Just me. And you'd be Mrs. Tolliver, I expect. We've been keeping it lit for you." He was maybe 15, sunburned across the nose, in rubber boots and a canvas jacket 2 sizes too honest for him, and he had taken his cap off before speaking, which told Edith more about how he had been raised than a letter of reference could have. He stood in the doorway with an armload of split firewood, as if arriving with firewood at a stranger's door were the most natural errand in the world. "Keeping what lit," Edith said. It did not come out as a question. "Who are you?" "Tobin, ma'am. Tobin Frisk. Gus Frisk's boy, from Saltmarsh." He waited a moment for the name to mean something to her, and when it did not, he shifted the wood on his arm and nodded at the table. The lamp. "Mr. Tolliver wrote to my dad, back when you 2 moved away inland. There was money in the letters, for kerosene and wick and my time, though Dad never let me keep the money part. The instructions were the same every month. Keep a lamp burning in the cottage window every night, sundown to sunrise. Keep the salt washed off the glass. Keep the path mowed so it looks like somebody's expected." He set the wood down by the stove and straightened up. "The letters stopped last October. We kept on anyway. Dad said the money was never the reason we did it." Edith heard herself ask why. Why would anyone light a lamp in an empty cottage every night for 4 years? The boy looked at her, and for the first time he seemed uncertain, as though the answer belonged to a country he had only heard described. "Don't rightly know, ma'am. I asked Dad the same thing once, when it was sleeting and I didn't much feel like walking out here. He turned the truck around and drove me himself, and all he said the whole ride was, 'We owe that man more than a lamp.'" Tobin picked his cap back up off the hook by the door. "I figured you'd know what it meant. Him being yours." Him being yours. Edith stood in the little room with the flame ticking softly in its glass, and understood that she did not know what it meant. That she did not know what any of it meant. The lamp, the letters, the money orders mailed from a sick room by a man who by then could barely sign his name. The firewood. The mowed path. The sign about a light that stays lit. She had come here with a release in her purse to knock all of it down for $900. "I've come to sell the place, Tobin," she said, because she was too tired to be anything but honest. "The company that's building on the headland. Their man is meeting me tomorrow in the village. I only need the one night." The boy went still all at once and completely, like water the second before it turns to ice. He did not argue. He was too well raised to argue. He put his cap on and touched the brim and said, "Then I'll leave you the wood anyway, ma'am. Gets cold out here when the sun goes." And at the door he stopped, with his back to her, and he said the only unboyish thing he said that whole first day. "My dad's alive because of this place. That's all I know about it. Sleeping in it one night before you kill it, that seems about right." Then he was gone down the path, and Edith Croyle was alone with a burning lamp and a purse full of papers and a sentence lodged under her ribs like a fishhook. She did not sleep much. The cottage held the night the old buildings on that coast hold it, creaking mildly, ticking as the boards let go of the day's sun, the sea working below the cliff with a sound like slow breathing. She lay under a quilt some thoughtful hand had kept aired and clean, watching the lamplight move on the ceiling, doing the terrible arithmetic of the widowed hour. 30 years of Warren coming in from his evening walk with the smell of wind on him, hanging his coat on the peg, saying nothing much. Where does a man go? An hour every evening, half his life. To look at the water, Edie. She had believed it, because there had been nothing in him that invited disbelief, no restlessness, nothing but a quiet so complete that in 34 years she had never seen the bottom of it. She had loved him the whole time. That was the thing. Loving him had been easy. Knowing him, she was beginning to suspect, had never actually been attempted. Sometime after midnight she got up, wrapped the quilt over her shoulders, and moved the lamp an inch to the left, to the center of the window sash, without having any idea why it mattered. Out in the dark, invisible, the tower stood over the cottage the whole owl hours of the night, and if she had been a fanciful woman she would have said it was waiting to see what she would do. Morning came up gold and enormous over the water. The meeting with the developer's man was not until 4 in the afternoon at the diner in Saltmarsh, and Edith had a day to spend in the ruins of her inheritance, so she did the thing she had been circling since the moment the hedges opened, the thing the whole point had been quietly insisting on. She took Warren's key ring from her purse, the ring the hospice nurse had handed her in a plastic bag, with his watch and his reading glasses, and she walked to the base of the tower, to the landward door with its riveted iron face and its 50 years of paint gone to powder, and she tried the big iron key, and it turned as if it had been oiled last Tuesday. Inside, the tower was a round brick throat going up into shadow, and it should have been foul with pigeons and rot and half a century of neglect. And it was not. The stairs spiraled up clean. The handrail, when she took it, came away leaving no rust on her palm, because someone had kept it painted. Edith stood at the bottom of the iron stairs the Tolliver family had laughed at for 50 years, looking up through the turning dark at the little coin of daylight far above. And she heard her own heart knocking, and could not have said whether it was from dread or from something that had no more sensible name. Then she began to climb. She had to stop 3 times, hand flat on the cold brick, breathing, and near the top of the tower the stairs delivered her into a small round room below the lantern itself, the watch room, the old keepers had called it, and Edith stopped on the last step with one hand on the rail, because the room was furnished. A chair with a folded blanket over its back, a shelf with a tin of lamp oil, a funnel, a box of wick, a small cast-iron stove, swept and blacked, and under the seaward window, facing the water, a desk. A keeper's desk, oak, scarred, polished along its front edge by generations of sleeves, with a single drawer, and in the front of the drawer a small brass keyhole. Edith knew the key before she had finished lifting the ring. She had seen it 1,000 times and asked about it exactly once, decades ago, sorting his pockets on laundry day. Small, brass, worn gold at the shoulders. "What's this little one for?" Warren. And Warren, reading the tide tables at the kitchen table, had said, without looking up, "That's for the thing I should have thrown away years ago." And she had laughed and dropped it back among the others, because it had sounded like a joke, and he had let it sound like one. She fit the key into the keeper's desk, 5 stories over the sea, in a room kept warm and swept by a hand she was only beginning to recognize. And then, if you can believe it, she stopped. Her hand on the key turned halfway, because below her, faint through the iron and the wind, she heard an engine on the point road, and then a horn, tapped twice, businesslike and cheerful, the horn of a man who has driven out early to look over a property he intends, very soon, to be standing on top of in a hard hat while it comes down. The developer had not waited for the diner. The developer had come to her. Whatever slept in that drawer had waited 31 years, and it was going to have to wait 1 hour more, and if Edith had known then what was written in that drawer, she would not have gone down those stairs to meet him. She would have bolted the door. The man leaning against the fender of a white truck at the head of the lane introduced himself as Bellamy, Acquisitions, Mercer Coastal Partners, and he had the handshake of a person who practices handshakes. He was younger than Edith had pictured, with the cheerful, unhurried confidence of a man whose company already owns both properties on either side of yours, and he apologized handsomely for coming out ahead of their appointment. "You can see why we want it, Mrs. Tolliver. Honestly, I'd want it just to stand on." He turned and considered the tower with his hands on his hips, squinting up at the rust weeping from the gallery, and he shook his head with what sounded, to his credit, like genuine regret. Shame about the structure. That thing was magnificent once, I'd bet. But our engineers took a look from the fence line last fall. The ironworks shot, the cliff edge is migrating. And the liability exposure alone, well, you've seen the numbers in the letter. Between us, 900 is generous for demolition consent on a condemned shell. The land value's already ours. We closed on the 2 neighboring parcels in March. Yours is the last piece. The last piece, Edith said. The very last. He smiled the smile of a man arriving at his favorite part. And I'll be straight with you, because I think you're a straight dealer. If the release isn't signed this week, the offer doesn't improve. It goes the other direction. The county's had that tower on its unsafe structures list since before I was hired. 1 petition from us and they'll order abatement themselves, and then, forgive me, you'd be paying for the demolition, ma'am, instead of us paying you. Nobody wants that. Your brother-in-law surely doesn't. Fine man Dale, by the by. He's been very helpful with the family history. There it was, dropped in gently, like a coin into a well, so she would hear how deep the arrangements already went. Dale had been talking to Mercer Coastal. Dale, who had waved the Lighthouse across the lawyer's table at her like a man scraping something off his shoe, had been helpful. Edith looked at the release sticking its white corner out of her purse, and she heard herself say, in a voice as pleasant as a closed door, 4 o'clock, Missed Bellamy at the diner as arranged. I haven't had my coffee yet. He laughed, held up his palms, said something gracious about widows driving harder bargains than admirals, and got into his truck. Only when the sound of him had faded down the lane did Edith understand what she had done. She had not refused. She had not agreed. She had bought herself 6 hours because of a burning lamp, a boy with an armload of firewood, and a small brass key sitting half-turned in a lock 5 stories over her head. She climbed the stairs again, all of them, faster than she should have. The drawer slid open on waxed runners, smooth as a breath. Inside, filling it completely, lay a package wrapped in oilcloth and tied with tarred line, square-cornered and tight. The wrapping of a man who had spent his life keeping things dry against weather. Her fingers shook on the knots. Under the oilcloth were books. Ordinary composition ledgers, the marbled kind schoolchildren use, 10 of them, their spines mended with fabric tape, and on the cover of the topmost, in block capitals she would have known on a gravestone at 100 paces, 3 hand-lettered words. Pelican Point Light. She opened the first book standing up, because it did not occur to her to sit, and the first page nearly stopped her heart, because the handwriting was not Warren's. It was a cramped, upright, old-fashioned hand, the ink gone brown, and the first entry was dated the 3rd of September, 1971. She read it 3 times. Government light extinguished this day by order. 42 years I kept her, and they put her out like a match. Weather fair, wind northwest. Lamp lit in the gallery, sundown, same as always. They can decommission the tower. They have not decommissioned me. Warren's grandfather. The last keeper, the old man in the one photograph on the parlor wall standing stern in a brass-buttoned coat, he had never stopped. The government had shut the station, unbolted the lens, boarded the door, and the old man had walked up those stairs that same night with a kerosene storm lamp and set it burning in the gallery, and he had written it down. Weather, wind, lamp lit, sundown, night after night, in entries so regular they read like a pulse. And then, a third of the book in, the entries changed. The old hand wavered, sickened, stopped midline halfway down a left-hand page, and the next entry, dated 4 days later, was in pencil, in a rounder, younger, patient hand that Edith had watched sign checks and birthday cards for over 3 decades. Granddad passed Tuesday. Lamp lit, sundown. He asked me once to see it through the winter. He didn't say which winter. That was all. That was the whole announcement. The entire ceremony of a 19-year-old inheriting a dead light in secret, and it was so exactly, unbearably Warren that Edith had to lower herself into the keeper's chair with the ledger against her chest, because that was the year before he married her, and she suddenly understood, with the force of a wave taking her feet, that every single evening of her married life, while she washed the supper dishes in the gray house and watched the point out the kitchen window, her husband had been up here. An hour, sometimes 2. Most evenings after supper, 31 years. Not walking. Not looking at the water. Climbing a condemned tower with a lamp and a pencil, and writing down the weather like a man still on duty for a government that had fired the whole family 50 years ago. She read until the sun moved. The entries were short, plain, and nearly all the same. Weather, wind, lamp lit, sundown, wick trimmed, glass washed. Some nights, oil low, some nights, gallery rail painted, ice on the steps, gulls nesting in the workroom again, small talk of a man maintaining a fortress against no army anyone else could see. But scattered through them, once or twice a month, sometimes more in the bad seasons, came entries of a different kind. Short lines with initials in them, and after the initials, 2 letters. Heavy fog, engine heard off the bar, held the lamp at the seaward rail 2 hours. G, F, home safe. Squall out of the northeast, boat late from the grounds. A, P, and boy. Home safe. Doctor's launch crossing to the island in weather no launch should cross in. Lamp and the bell. Home safe. 2 skiffs racing the tide off the point, fools, children, both home safe. Home safe. Home safe. Down the margins of 31 years, in faded pencil, over and over that same 2-word verdict until the words stopped even being words to her and became what they had been to him, account kept. A ledger of nights when someone out on black water had needed one fixed point of light on a coast the charts said had gone dark, and had found one there, and had followed it in, and had never once known who to thank. Edith Croyle sat in the watchroom of a decommissioned lighthouse with her husband's secret open on her knees, and thought about every night he had come in from his walk and hung up his coat, with salt on his shoulders and kerosene on his hands, and nothing at all on his face, and she said to the empty room, in a voice that cracked down its whole length, "You absolute fool. You could have told me. Why would you never let anybody thank you?" The ledgers did not answer, but something else in that drawer did, partly, and she almost missed it, because it had slid flat beneath the oilcloth. A coffee can, the old kind with a soldered seam, heavy when she lifted it, and stuffed so full the lid had bowed. She worked it open expecting nails or pencils. It was money. And it was letters, bills of every age, ones and fives, and a 20 soft as cloth. Folded inside notes and around notes, dozens upon dozens of them, pushed through the cottage door slot over decades, addressed to nobody, because nobody knew a name to address. For the light Tuesday night. We didn't drown because of you. From Marguerite, whose boys came home. God keep the man on the point, whoever he is. Not one bill spent. Not one note answered. 31 years of thank yous from an entire coastline, sealed in a can like seeds he never once considered his to plant. And at 4 o'clock, with 2 ledgers under her arm and her heart going like a bell buoy in a gale, Edith walked into the Saltmarsh diner where the man from Mercer Coastal sat waiting with his papers in a leather folder. And the story stops being about a woman deciding whether to sell a lighthouse now, because that decision was already made. Stay with me, because what happened in that diner is the moment the whole town found out what you already know, and if this story has its hooks in you the same as that log had them in Edith, this is the time to subscribe, so you never miss the one we tell next week. The Saltmarsh diner at 4 o'clock held the Between Tides crowd, 6 or 7 men in rubber boots at the counter, 2 women splitting a piece of pie by the window, and Bellamy at the corner table with his leather folder squared in front of him like a place setting. He rose, pulled out her chair, ordered her a coffee she had not asked for, and uncapped a pen. I took the liberty of flagging the signature lines, he said. It's a short document. Demolition consent, salvage waiver, and the release of the 900. We can have a check cut by Friday. Edith did not sit. She stood beside the table in a diner she had eaten in 1,000 times in another life, and she set the 2 ledgers down on top of his leather folder, and she said, loudly enough that she heard the counter conversation die behind her, before I sign anything, I'd like to know if the initials G, F, mean something to anybody in this room. The stillness that followed had texture to it. The fry cook shut off his scraper. One of the men at the counter turned around slowly on his stool, a thick-set man in his 40s with a beard going gray at the chin, and Edith knew him at once for the boy's father, because the boy had his exact stillness. That'd be me, ma'am, Goose Frisk said. Gustav Frisk. And you'd be Mrs. Tolliver. His eyes went to the marbled ledgers, and something moved through his face like weather. Where'd you find those? At the top of my husband's lighthouse, in a locked desk. She opened the first ledger to the place she had marked with a sugar packet, and she read it out, slowly, into a room gone so quiet she could hear the coffee machine breathe. Heavy fog, engine heard off the bar, held the lamp at the seaward rail 2 hours. G, F, home safe. She looked up. There are 10 books like this. They start in September of 1971, and they end 4 years ago, and there are initials like these on hundreds of the pages. I drove out here to sell that tower for scrap, and I would like someone in this town to tell me what my husband was doing up there for 31 years, because he never told me one word. Nobody spoke first. Everybody spoke first. That is how it actually happened. A dozen years of held breath letting go at once, chairs scraping, the pie forgotten, boots crossing the floor. It was the old man in the corner who won, a lean, sun-cured man of about 80, with hands like mooring cleats, who stood up out of his booth with his cap already off. Amos Petty, he said. Miss, my father fished this bar his whole life, and his father, and me, and my boy. You go far enough back in those books, you'll find an entry says A, P, and boy. Squall out of the Northeast. His voice was steady in the wholly unconvincing manner of a man deciding sentence by sentence not to weep. That boy was my Nathan. 11 years old. We lost the engine coming home from the grounds, and the tide had us set dead onto the point, black as the inside of a cow, and I told my son to get the life jacket on, and I did not tell him why. And then there was a light. Up high, where no light had any business being, because the government put that tower out when I was a young man. It was there. Fixed, somebody standing at that rail in a full gale holding a lamp, long enough for me to get my bearings off it and pull us over the flat into the lee. 2 hours, your book says. I never knew it was 2 hours. I never knew who. He stopped and worked his jaw and said the rest straight at her. We ran up to the point next morning, and the gate was chained same as always, and we told ourselves we'd imagined it. Man can't say what he saw in weather like that. But there wasn't a fisherman on this coast didn't half believe in the light on Pelican Point. We didn't talk about it to outsiders. It was ours, like the weather is ours. He looked at the ledger the length of a long breath. Warren Tolliver. All them years. He'd stand in this diner buying penny candy for other men's kids, and you'd never get 6 words out of him, and the whole time. He didn't finish. He put his cap back on, which on that coast is a way of finishing. Bellamy, to his credit, had the sense to stay quiet for most of it. He was less a villain than a man holding a suddenly much heavier folder, and when he finally spoke, he did it gently. Mrs. Tolliver, this is a remarkable story. Truly, it doesn't change the engineering, and it doesn't change the offer, and it can't change the calendar. I need the release, signed by Friday, or the company petitions the county Tuesday morning and the abatement route begins. And that route ends with the same bulldozer and you holding the invoice. He gathered his papers and stood. For whatever it's worth, I'm sorry, it really is a hell of a story. It isn't a story, said Gus Frisk quietly, from the counter. It's the reason I've got a son to send out there with firewood. Edith drove back to the point at sunset with the ledgers on the seat beside her. And if you've made it this far into Edith's story, you already understand what she was only beginning to. Warren had not left her a building. He had left her a promise 100 years old, and the question was no longer whether she could afford to keep it. It was whether anyone, anywhere, could afford what it would cost her by Friday. That night she climbed the tower in the dark, because she wanted to stand where he had stood, and on the gallery bolted to the rail in a fitted iron bracket, she found the lamp itself. Not the little cottage lamp, the lamp. A great brass storm lantern with a polished reflector the size of a dinner plate, its glass spotless under a canvas hood, its tank full, its wick trimmed square and ready, a tin of matches wired to the bracket beside it. 4 years it had hung there. He had filled and trimmed and hooded it the autumn the doctor sent them inland, and left it ready, like boots by the door. Whatever Warren Tolliver had believed about his illness, he had not believed the light was finished. She stood at the rail with her hand on the cold brass and the black water breathing below. And it was there, not in the diner, not in the courthouse, that Edith stopped thinking of the tower as his and began, quietly, without permission or paperwork, to think of it as hers to defend. And then, reading in the cottage till the small hours because sleep had become a country she visited rather than lived in, she found the other initials. They were scattered down all 31 years, a handful of times each year, always the same 2 letters, and they stopped her breath, because every other initial in those books belonged to a boat. E.C. Home Safe. E.C. Home Safe. Edith Croyle. Her own maiden initials, in her husband's pencil, over and over across 3 decades, on dates that meant nothing to her. And no wind, no weather, no boat recorded beside them. She sat with the lamp hissing softly and the book open on her knees, and could not for her life work out what she had ever been saved from. And that question, of all of them, is the one whose answer you will want to hear with your own ears before this story ends. Dale called her in the morning, before 7, which was his idea of an ambush. Bellamy tells me you didn't sign. His voice had the wounded reasonableness he used the whole month the estate closed. Edith, honey, what are we doing here? That check is the only nickel that pile of brick will ever produce. You know I put in a word for you with those people. There's a consideration in it for the family when the parcel closes. And Lord knows we've all earned it after what these 4 years cost everybody. What they cost everybody, Edith said. You know what I mean. Dale, did you know about the log? The silence went on one beat too long, and she felt it like a draft under a door. You did. You knew what he did up there. I knew my brother liked to play lighthouse keeper, same as the whole family knew, and we had the good taste not to embarrass him about it, Dale said. It's a hobby, Edith, not an estate asset. Grown man climbing stairs to burn kerosene for seagulls. Now you listen. Mercer files Tuesday. When the county condemns it, and it will, the demolition lien lands on you. I'm not going to stand by and watch you bankrupt what's left of this family for a chimney. A pause, and then, softer, the true Dale showing through the seam. Sign the release, and I'll see you get a piece of our consideration too. That's family money. Honey, he'd have wanted you looked after. She hung up on him. It was the single rudest thing Edith Croyle had done in 30 years, and her hand was still on the phone when she understood exactly what had bothered her about Bellamy's speech in the diner. Every threat in it ran through the county. The unsafe structures list. The abatement order. If the county was the gun, then somewhere in the county courthouse there was a file on Pelican Point. And Warren, who had quietly paid the taxes on that point every April for 3 decades, had never in his life left a thing he loved unprotected. He mended ledgers with fabric tape. He wrapped books in oilcloth against a roof that did not leak. Men like that do not leave their lighthouse relying on the mercy of a zoning board. The recorder of deeds for the county was a small, iron-haired woman named Verna Odom, who had held the office longer than most of the commissioners had held jobs, and when Edith gave the parcel number, she did not go to her computer. She went to a wall of leather-spined index books, and she came back with her glasses pushed up into her hair and an expression Edith would remember for the rest of her life. The expression of a person who has waited 19 years for someone to ask her the right question. You'd be the widow, Verna said. I wondered when one of you would come in. Sit down, dear, there's an instrument on this parcel, recorded 19 years back, and I know it's there because I stamped it myself, and I remember the man who brought it in, because he stood at that counter in a raincoat and asked me 3 times whether recording it meant it would still bind the land if everybody involved was dead. She laid the book open and turned it to face Edith and tapped the page with one finger. Deed of easement. The instrument dedicates the tower on Pelican Point, in perpetuity, as a private aid to navigation, for the benefit of the fishing fleet of Saltmarsh Harbor and their successors, with a covenant that runs with the land. No structure serving as the aid may be demolished, encumbered, or removed while it remains capable of service, and, here's the part I remembered for 19 years, capability of service is to be presumed so long as a light can be shown from the gallery. Verna took her glasses down out of her hair at last and looked at Edith over the top of them. Your husband didn't own that lighthouse, Mrs. Tolliver. Not in the manner those resort men use the word. He chained it to the town before you and I were gray, and then he walked out of here into the rain like a man who'd just paid off a mortgage. Whoever's promising to bulldoze it is promising you something that has not been legally possible since before his hair went. Mercer Coastal filed its petition Tuesday morning anyway, and the hearing was set for the following Tuesday in the commission room of the county courthouse, a chamber of brown paneling and folding chairs built for an attendance of 9. Bellamy came with a senior attorney named Pratt, silver-haired and courteous as a scalpel, and Dale came too and sat with them, on their side of the aisle. And if Edith had ever wondered where her brother-in-law stood, the seating chart retired the question. Pratt spoke first, and he was good. He did not sneer at the easement. He held it up admiringly, called it a touching piece of drafting, and then set about opening its seams. The instrument protects a functioning aid to navigation, he told the commissioners. Council concedes the covenant runs with the land. But covenants require substance, and the substance here lapsed decades ago. No light has shone from that gallery in 4 years at minimum, on the family's own account. Before that, whatever glow a hobbyist may have carried up those stairs was never charted. never sanctioned, never relied upon by any documented mariner. The condition of service has failed. The tower is a hazard, gentlemen, dressed in a dead man's sentiment, and sentiment does not hold up a rusted gallery, and it will not compensate this county when the first trespassing child falls from it. The chairman asked if anyone present wished to speak to the petition. And then the doors at the back of the room opened, and did not close again for 4 full minutes. They came in single file because the aisle was narrow, men in their 40s and their 60s and their 80s, in boots and church jackets, caps coming off in a wave as they crossed the threshold, wives with them and grown sons, until the folding chairs were gone and they stood along the paneling 3 deep, and the room smelled of salt and diesel. Gus Frisk carried the coffee can. Tobin carried the ledgers, all 10, stacked to his chin. And one by one, without a lawyer among them, the fleet of Saltmarsh Harbor stood up and named their knights. Amos Petty went first, cap in his fists. 4th of October, the year the cannery burned. Me and my boy. Nathan's the tall one by the door. He's got a boat of his own now and 2 kids. We're in the book, sir. You can check the weather service against every date in it if you think a dead man got his squalls wrong. A broad woman in her 70s rose from the second row and did not wait to be recognized. Marguerite Halt. 2 skiffs racing the tide off the point, fools, children, both home safe. Those fools were my sons, and they're standing behind me, and the man who wrote that they were fools was right, and I've been putting flowers under that gallery rail every October for 30 years without knowing whose rail it was. She sat down again with the finality of a hatch cover dropping. And the doctor's launch, that was my father's crossing, said a gray-haired woman near the windows, quietly, he got to the island that night. The child he went for is a schoolteacher now. Pratt objected, gently, that memory was not evidence, and the room did not boo him, because that coast does not boo, but it breathed at him. It was Gus Frisk who answered, setting the coffee can on the commissioner's table with a wrap and pulling from inside his jacket a packet of envelopes tied in tarred line. Letters from Warren Tolliver to my father and me, 4 years of them, with money for kerosene, instructing us to keep a lamp burning at the cottage window every night, sundown to sunrise, which we have done, sirs, every night, without one missed, so council can retire the word lapsed. And as to the gallery. He looked at Pratt with a fisherman's flat patience. The storm lantern is hanging on its bracket this minute, trimmed in full. Your instrument says, capable of service, sir. Give me a match and 10 minutes of your time, and the whole county can watch the point light up from this window. The chairman looked at Pratt for a long moment, and what he said next entered the folklore of that county the same evening. Counsel, I've heard you argue that the light failed this town. I'm looking at 100 people who came in from the tide to say the town never noticed a failure. The petition for abatement is denied. The easement stands as recorded, and speaking for myself and off the record, if Mercer Coastal wants a resort on that headland, it can build one with a working lighthouse in the postcards, and thank this room for the privilege. The gavel came down on the sound of boot stamping, which on that coast is applause. Dale caught her at the door. He looked smaller out of the room's momentum, a man who had come to collect a consideration and instead had watched 100 people weep over a brother he had spent 50 years introducing as a punchline. What finally came out of him was quiet and unarmored and, Edith thought later, the most honest sentence he ever spoke to her. He never told me either. He put his hat on. The whole time we were laughing at him. She watched him go down the courthouse steps alone and found she had no appetite for the anger she had packed for the occasion, because vindication, when it finally arrives, almost never tastes of triumph. It tastes of grief getting its facts straight at last. There is one piece left, and it is the piece Edith herself did not find until that night, at the cottage table, when she opened the last of the 10 ledgers to its final written page. The entry was dated the 14th of July, 4 years past, the week the doctors sent them inland for good, and it was short, like all of them. Weather fair, wind southwest. Lamp lit, sundown, lamp filled, trimmed, and hooded for the next hand. And below it, where 31 years of records ended, the pencil kept going, in the same patient print, addressed for the first and only time in all 10 books to a reader. She read it, with her thumb moving over the letters. For Edith, if it's you that finds this. I expect it will be, because you were always the one who found things. The initials in these books are boats, all but one set. E.C. is you. Every night you drove back late from your sister's, every crossing you made in weather, every time you were out in the dark of the world and I couldn't do one useful thing about it, I climbed up and lit the lamp and stood with it until I heard your car on the Shell Road, and then I wrote you down with the rest of the saved, because a man should keep an honest count of every time his heart came home. You'll be angry I never told you. Be angry. Then light it, Edie, on July the 14th, and any night after that when someone you love is abroad in the dark. It answers everything you'll want to ask me. The oil's paid for. The door's not locked. It never was. Edith Croyle sat alone in a kerosene circle of light at the foot of a dead tower, 56 years old, with $81 left in the world and an entire harbor asleep below her, and laughed and wept into her hands at the same time, because the question she had carried since the funeral was answered, and the answer was larger than the question. She had spent 8 months asking what her husband had left her. The answer was the count. The answer was 100 people who came in off the tide. The answer was a hobby, Dale called it, a chimney with delusions, which turned out to be the truest sentence anyone ever wrote about him, because the most valuable thing a person can leave behind is a light he burned for people who never knew his name. On the 14th of July, at sundown, a month after a bulldozer parked on the neighboring parcel had quietly been loaded onto its trailer and driven away, Edith climbed to the gallery with the storm lantern's matches in her jacket pocket, and the whole harbor stood off the point on a flat gold sea to watch. She unhooded the lamp her husband had left trimmed for the next hand. She struck the match on the rail, and for the first time in 4 years, a light opened up over the water from the gallery of Pelican Point, steady and small and enough, and every horn in the harbor answered it at once, and Tobin Frisk, standing in the bow of his father's boat, swore forever afterward that the tower hummed. Below, on the cottage table, the 11th ledger already lay open, with one entry in a widow's handwriting. Weather fair, wind southwest. Lamp lit, sundown, all of them. Home safe. She lives there still. The rent is a match a night. The light stays lit, and the door is never locked, and somewhere on the dark water that is the whole of the law, maybe there was a Warren in your life too. Somebody quiet whose whole love only showed itself in the count they kept. And maybe you never got to thank them either. So tell us, would you have signed the release that first morning, when the money was real and the log was still locked in its drawer? Or do you believe, with Edith, that some inheritances only look worthless because they're priceless? Tell us where in the world you're listening from tonight. Down in the comments, we read every one. And if this story kept a lamp lit for you, subscribe and be here next week, because we tell one of these true-hearted stories every week. Good night, friend. Get home safe.